you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This morning's Old Testament reading is one that we've surely heard before. Adam, Eve, and the great fall of humankind. Actually, this biblical story runs the risk of being a little too familiar. We've heard it so many times that we read things into it, themes, theology, insinuations, and implications that actually aren't there. For example, there is no apple in Genesis 3, nor is there any implication that the snake is the devil. Those both come from Milton's Paradise Lost. And in fact, the story we read this morning never uses the word fall or even the word sin. And so as best as we can, I want to try this morning to strip away some of the baggage that comes with this text so that we can hear the story as it's written, not the story as we've developed it in the tradition and theology of the church. Because I think what we might actually have here is a story about what happens when we as humans disregard God's boundaries. There is a hymn by the late church musician Thomas Traeger that treats the story this way, as a story about boundaries. It was in our old blue Presbyterian hymnal, but it did not make the cut for the new purple hymnal, so we are not singing it this morning. And that's probably just as well, because I don't think anybody actually knows this song. And I've never known a congregation of Presbyterians to sing it. The hymn is called God Marked a Line and Told the Sea. Show of hands, anyone's favorite? Show of hands, anyone heard of it? Even Brian? Oh, we're in trouble. So, there you go. It is not a crowd favorite, but it is a fascinating little hymn. And it begins before this morning's story, actually in Genesis 1, when God separates the sea and the dry land. It goes like this. God marked a line and told the sea its surging tides and waves were free to travel up the sloping strand, but not to overtake the land. Maybe a fool's errand to try to sing to you at 35 weeks. Having laid out the first example of God setting a boundary in the natural order of where the sea can go, Traeger ventures into this morning's text, Genesis 2, as he begins to explore the limits that God has placed on human autonomy. God set one limit in the glade where tempting fruits and branches swayed, and that first limit stands behind the limit that the Lord defined. Boundaries. Boundaries are an important ingredient that makes life together in human community possible. There's a line that many of y'all have probably heard me say over and over when people act badly in a church context. People act badly in church? What? And that line is this: we accept all people, we do not accept all behaviors. There are certain limits that we agree to when we come into this space, shared assumptions about what our life together looks like. For example, God created us all as beautiful, diverse human bodies. And as we just heard in Genesis, God created us to be naked and unashamed. But when we come to church, we put clothes on those beautiful, diverse human bodies of ours, and I think we all generally agree that that's a very good thing. There are other boundaries that we put in place to organize our common life. We run background checks on the people that work with our children. If someone is behaving inappropriately at a church gathering, yelling, shouting insults at people, we take them aside and we ask them to stop or to leave. And we do this kind of thing intuitively. It's not as if we say, someone's acting out, we should invoke the anti-harassment policy. Though I'm glad to say we do finally have one. We are back in compliance with the Book of Order. No, it's more like we have this innate, God-given sense of what behaviors nurture community life and what limits need to be set to protect against behaviors that degrade, demean, dehumanize, and detract from life together. We don't set boundaries to be punitive or to distinguish between who is righteous and who is sinful because we understand, because we are all both. I think we set boundaries in the church and in our lives because we are a people shaped by the narrative of Genesis 2 and 3. Because we understand that life together is healthier and happier when we are willing to accept certain limits on our freedom for the sake of the common good. The line, the limit, and the law are patterns meant to help us draw between what life requires and all the things our heart desires. The same is true in the secular world. There are limits that exist on our human freedom, power, and agency. We don't always agree on what those limits should be, but most of us do seem to understand that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed lest we harm the larger community of God's creation. Limits like how much money we can amass for ourselves before we have to start paying it back in our taxes. Or how much carbon we can safely use before our lifestyle becomes a danger to the well-being of the planet that we all call home. When the serpent comes to tempt Eve, his argument is very compelling. He says, when you eat this fruit, you will be like God, knowing good and knowing evil. But I'm not so sure it's even about knowing good and evil. Surely Eve has some inkling of the difference between good and evil, or she would not be having an internal moral debate about whether or not to eat the forbidden fruit. No, I think that the godlike power the snake offers us may be more about deciding what is good and what is evil for ourselves. Perhaps the temptation is not to greater knowledge, but to give ourselves permission to set our own moral compasses and to live our lives as if we were not fully dependent upon God and upon one another. be like God. The sad irony is, of course, they are already like God. Remember, back in Genesis 1, God creates humankind in God's image. And then God sets us in the garden with a purpose to till the earth and to keep it. We are already co-creators, co-conspirators with God in the marvelous work of creation. Just because there are limits on our vocation does not mean it is not holy. God creates us in God's own image, and in the same breath, then, God gives us finitude. And we are aware at the same time of our great significance and our great insignificance, of our agency and of our limitations. But discontent with finite powers, we reach to take what is not ours, and then defend our claim by force, and swerve from life's intended course. In traditional theology, this text ends with a curse and a fall. Adam and Eve are expelled from paradise and estranged from their once intimate relationship with God. That is a very bleak outlook on life. Friends, is there any good news that we can take away from this story? I wonder if the good news comes with accepting our human limitations. Perhaps the good news is more of an invitation when we come to the limits of our own strength, intelligence, will, and agency, not to despair, but to joyfully and lovingly embrace our finitude. For when we come to the end of ourselves, we see clearly that God is God and we are not, and that's okay. Friends, I wonder what would happen when we encounter those places in our lives of our own limitations, if instead of understanding them as personal failures, we came to regard those places as holy ground. We have come to the place where we step back and God takes over. The divine and human partnership for which we were